All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the latest episode of Mr. Woods' Classroom on Egyptian mythology. Egyptian mythology. So, we're going to be talking about just a few of the Egyptian gods, as well as maybe a couple stories here and there, just so you get a sense of the Egyptian religion, how these folks lived their lives, and what they believed was going on. So, we're going to get started. I had meant to have this out this morning, but unfortunately, Animal Crossing, turnips, you got to find the prices. So that's been keeping me a little bit too busy there. Um, but I'm here for you now to get through some of this stuff. So let's move on here. Okay, so Ra is the first god that we're going to discuss. You can see him pictured over there on the left. And Ra is the Egyptian god of the sun. So he's kind of the chief deity, even if he's not always considered like the king, he is seen as the highest and most powerful deity out there. The ancient Egyptians actually believed that their explanation for how the sun sets was that the god Ra was being swallowed at night by the goddess Nut, who represents the earth. So the earth is this goddess Nut, the sky is Geb, and that Ra would travel across the sky and be swallowed by the earth, and is then reborn every morning. So they think that as he's traveling through the underworld, he appears with the head of a ram, and he's slightly different character there altogether. And it's important to remember, when we're discussing mythology, to these ancient peoples, this was their religion. So we can't discount the power that it would have had on their daily life, because we can look around us today and see how influential religion is for us. For the ancient Egyptians, it's no less significant in their lives. The only difference is we look at this as being primitive or strange, the same way they would look at Hinduism or Christianity or Islam as being primitive. So we just have to take a step outside of our own culture and remember, what the world would have looked like in its time and place, and from that perspective, in order to get a pretty good understanding of it. So the next fellow to talk about is Amun. Amun is considered probably one of the most powerful gods in ancient Egypt. He is the hidden one. So he is probably more significant in Upper Egypt, so in the southern part of the Egyptian territory. He's often considered the king of the gods, although that is kind of disputed. In fact, later in Egyptian history, because remember we're talking about 3,000 plus years of history that these gods are active in different ways. The religion changes, it evolves, and so these gods are sometimes mixed together. In this way, you'll see Amun and Ra, the god we just talked about, actually kind of blend together to make Amun Ra. So you see these slight changes in the religion. It's not unique to Egypt, although Egyptian religion tends to blend with other cultures and itself more than I have seen other ones do. But you have religions like Hinduism that adapt, and the different forms of Brahma change. So this is not unique to Egyptian religion, that you would have a god and another god kind of mixed together to create one entity. It's a way of understanding and explaining how that pantheon of gods operates. And sometimes the backgrounds of these gods are a little bit mysterious, or we're not exactly sure, or even people in that time period had conflicting ideas about where certain gods came from. And we'll talk about that here and then later on with like the Greco-Roman myths as well. This is Osiris. So Osiris becomes like the lord of the underworld. And so this was unwittingly. He was kind of the king of all of Egypt. And so there's four siblings here to concern ourselves with. Three of them are pictured. You can see Osiris, who is seated there, and then directly behind him you can see two women standing. The first woman, and you can see, of course, Egyptian art is very two-dimensional. The first woman, let me just mark her here in red, right? You can see her directly here. That is Osiris's wife, Isis. And then right behind him, with the blue arrow, you can see his sister, Nethys. So these are actually both his sisters. He's just married to one. The one that is missing is his brother, Set, who we'll get to here as we go. Osiris is known for being the father of Horus. He and Isis conceive Horus, and he's a god that's associated with fertility. He's a god associated with resurrection. He is the first deity to be mummified, and that's where the tradition of mummification comes from. And so, just very briefly, and I'll probably, because I'm going to recite this story kind of from memory here, so I'll likely get some elements of it wrong, or reading from a different interpretation. But the myth of like Isis and Osiris is one of the older ones in Egyptian mythology, and it basically states that so Osiris was this king of Egypt. His brother Set was very jealous. Set is associated with chaos, so he's kind of like the god of chaos, and he's very jealous of his brother. Wants that power for himself, so he sets out to build this golden box, basically. So he measures Osiris to make sure that the box is perfectly his size, sets out to build this golden box and makes it beautiful, and basically says, he throws this party, everybody's there. So anybody who can lay down and fit in the box, it goes to them. So of course several people try. It's almost like an Arthurian sword in the stone sort of thing. Osiris comes up, he lays down the box, and of course he fits perfectly because it's tailor-made for him. And as soon as he lays down, Set throws the lid on the box and starts pounding nails in, basically entombing him in this golden box. It's then depending on the versions, I've seen it like where it's covered in lead, like molten lead to hold it shut, thrown into the river. When Isis finds out about this, she flies out to find her husband, and she sees this box trapped in a tree, basically. So she gets this box open and realizes it's her husband. Of course, he's dead. So she starts to figure out how she's going to bring him back to life. So she goes to gather the necessary tools to do so, and to maybe even go through that process. Set finds the body, figures out what his sister's going to do, so he cuts them up into pieces and scatters them all over Egypt. So anyway, eventually Isis gathers these pieces back up, brings her husband back to life briefly, long enough for them to conceive a child together, and then he goes to take his rightful place as the Lord of the Underworld. Of course, he's embalmed before this goes on, and Anubis is part of that. I think Anubis is the son of Nethys, and she's involved in helping Isis in this process. Like I said, I may have gotten some elements of that story wrong, but together they conceive Horus, the younger, who will go on to be kind of the pharaoh king of Egypt and take his father's place, and he fights against Set and all that fun stuff. Here's Isis. Like I said, she can fly. She's often associated with magic. She's associated with helping people. She is considered the throne of Egypt. So the first throne on which the god King Horus sat would have been in his mother's lap. So she's often associated with, the queen mother of Egypt. Here's Horus, god of the sky. Like I said, he's probably the most well known. A lot of people are familiar with like the Eye of Horus, the stylized Egyptian eye, because Horus loses an eye in combat, and that eye is dedicated and it's able to it becomes a symbol of like protection later down the road. The Egyptians believed that every pharaoh that ever held power was the living Horus. So if you remember in the Egyptian PowerPoint, I talked about how Hatshepsut, right, Queen Hatshepsut, would refer to herself as a man. She would take that masculine identity, and that's because she has to be the god Horus, so a male god, the kind of living embodiment of that god. So Horus basically trains up after his father is killed, and he goes and sets out to fight against Set or Seth, who he will defeat in battle. And he's going to, like I said, lose an eye in the process there, and that eye becomes a symbol of protection. All right, so we have Anubis up next. Anubis is the god of embalming and the dead. I think I mentioned this in the presentation there before about how Egyptians would often see jackals in the graveyards. And so the jackal-headed god Anubis becomes often associated with sort of protecting cemeteries and the dead. He's often responsible for guiding the dead through the underworld. We'll talk about that process in a minute, as well as just kind of being the gatekeeper of that. He, like I said, helped embalm Osiris after the conflict with Set. And so he's associated with mummification. You would actually have Egyptian individuals wearing masks of Anubis over their face, and they would be the ones the priests involved in the embalming process. So next up here we have Amit or Amut. I believe Amut is commonly associated with like a female deity. And you can see that Amut is made up of a couple different animal parts here, and that's something we need to talk about. You've likely noticed many of the Egyptian gods have like animal characteristics to them, or they, like the head of a falcon and the body of a man, or what have you. So anthropomorphism, or having human characteristics, animals with human characteristics, or these anthropomorphic gods. That's kind of a tell of a lot of Egyptian gods and goddesses. It's not necessary, right? So you can see Osiris was human. He's often colored green because he's dead, but not necessarily having to be. So that characteristic is something that's common with Egypt, and it's likely because of the large wealth of animals that they had and the power that those animals held in their lives. So it's often probably associated with that. One of the gods that I don't have included here, a god named Wepawet, which is like a silver wolf-headed god, was a hunter god. So if you think of wolves as being hunters, that makes sense. Or if you think of Anubis, the jackals in the cemeteries, right? So this god or goddess actually makes quite a bit of sense. So these three animals you can see, you've got a crocodile up there at the top making up the head. The kind of front half of the body is supposed to be a lion, and then the back half of the body is actually a hippopotamus. So if we think of kind of those three major deadly animals in Egypt, in ancient Egypt, the lion, the hippo, and the crocodile would have been some of the most fearsome. So putting these all together to create the devourer of souls, or the devourer of the dead, makes perfect sense. So Amut actually would sit next to the scales, which we'll get to, and if your heart did not balance with the feather of truth, well, he would just devour it, leading you to an eternity of limbo in the underworld. Nobody wants that, right? So try to avoid Amut's bite if possible. Here's Set. I guess there is Set right above me. So he is the god of chaos. He is discord in life, so he threatens harmony. And this is something, almost every major ancient religion or even modern religion has some character that represents kind of the non-harmonious lifestyle, whether that's Satan in Christianity, or if it's Set, or if it Loki in Norse myth, or if you go to Greek, it's often associated with Hades, but not necessarily having to be. So you often have this figure who represents some discord or some chaos in life. Set or Seth, you'll see Seth is kind of the modern understanding of the name, but Set is often how it's pronounced. So you see that he is kind of this evil individual. We talked about the usurping of the royal line. We talked about the fratricide, him killing his brother, the battle with his nephew, and all of that. So what we don't necessarily always know is exactly what Set's anthropomorphic animal form is. Is he an anteater? Is he a some type of jackal or something like that? We're not entirely sure. Aardvark, what is he exactly? We don't know, and it's not really clarified. Probably some type of aardvark or anteater or something like that. Apophis. So Apophis is this other chaos deity. You can see him here in this picture. He's the giant serpent. So he's older than Set, seen as an enemy of Mot, which we'll talk about as truth or order. Apophis is this giant serpent that lives in the underworld and is there to prevent travelers from reaching the field of reeds, which is the ultimate goal in traveling through the underworld. You want to reach resurrection of some form. So he's there to prevent travelers from doing that, as well as other things. But actually, individuals who have played the Assassin's Creed Origins video game will know him. You have to fight him on your quest to figure out what happened to your son. So there's Ma'at. So Ma'at represents order and truth, light. So she's kind of this good deity. So she's not just representing she isn't just a goddess of those things, she actually is those things. So the word Ma'at in Egyptian, or Coptic Egyptian, refers to these different things. So it refers to order and light and truth and all of those. So you can see that she regulates things that deal with order, stars and the actions of mortals, things that should be in order. She's also associated with a portion of the afterlife process called the 42 declarations of purity. We'll talk about those, or the 42 negative confessions. We'll look at those in a minute. And her like I said, her feather is what your heart is weighed against in the afterlife. Nephthys, here you can see her back here in the back. Again, right here. And so she is the protective goddess of the dead. She's, associated with, the burial of Osiris. She's the mother of Anubis. And so she's often seen in funerary texts or carved on the sarcophagi. So here we see Sobek. Sobek is one of the gods of the Nile. Connected to the Nile and also to the kings. And his temples, like the one you would have seen in the presentation on Egypt, are actually quite interesting because they are often filled with live crocodiles. So, imagine going to pray to Sobek and you're mingling with all of these living crocodiles in shallow wading pools in this temple built along the Nile. So he isn't the god of the Nile. Like, he isn't the river itself. He's more of a protector of the Nile. So think about crocodiles living in the Nile and protecting it. So that's probably where that association came from. Next, you can see Tawaret, or Tawaret. See her on the left here. She's the hippopotamus. She's often associated with pregnancy and childbirth. She's the goddess who protects women during this process. So she's quite significant in Egyptian mythology. There's a lot of temples constructed for her and a lot of personal temples constructed for her. So if you think about that process, the process of getting pregnant, bearing children, not only is that important for personal reasons, right? One might want to have kids, but on top of that, that is important for kings and queens, right? It's necessary to extend your family line, and even if you're not of royal blood, it's necessary to pass on your belongings and what you own. It's also an incredibly dangerous process. Right? It's still dangerous today. The mortality rate for children and pregnant mothers is much higher than it ought to be. And so if you go back 5,000 years in history, not nearly the medical advances or technology that we have today to keep those women safe and to keep the children safe. So this goddess would have been incredibly important, something that probably all women and many men would have prayed to for protection for their families and their wives. So this is the god Tot. He is the god of writing. So he's the scribe of the gods. You can see him in that picture, in that petroglyph there, doing his little carving. He's got his stylus and his tablet. Egyptians would believe that Tot is the one who gave them writing. So he's connected with writing. He's the scribe of the gods, puts him in a higher class of gods. So he's up there near the king of the gods, and you'll see him in the funerary text. He's responsible for recording all of the information. Scribes and the ability to read and write were incredibly important, so much so that they devoted a god to it. Aten, who is not the person here, right? You can see the pharaoh here. That's supposed to be the pharaoh Akhenaten, or spirit of Aten. If you remember about the Egyptian pharaoh who changed the religion, the father of King Tut, that's him there. Aten is up here at the top. That's the sun disk god right there. Wow, that's a bad arrow. Sorry, folks. Good thing I'm not an art teacher. So he is the kind of the form of the sun that is Ra, except the disk itself. And of course, he becomes incredibly important during the rule of Akhenaten, insofar as he's the only god that is worshipped during that time. Bastet, the cat goddess, protective goddess, often associated with kind of gentle. It says here that sometimes the head of the lioness is there for protecting kings in battle. We're going to talk about that in a second, because when she has the head of a lioness, she actually takes the form of a different god altogether. But the cat is a symbol of Bastet. Cats are often associated with royalty in ancient Egypt. They're even mummified. There's lots of statues. So there is a lot of information and a lot of sanctity associated with just those animals in general, but also with the goddess Bastet. And like we said down here at the bottom, there's a temple, Bubastis, that is located in the Nile River Delta that was constructed in honor of Bastet. Like I said, with the lion head, that's Sekhmet. Sometimes Sekhmet is seen as like the daughter of Bastet, or the daughter of Ra, sister of Bastet. Other times she's just another form of Bastet. So like I said, that varies over time. But she's a warrior goddess. She's got her spear and she leads people into battle. She's a protector of the pharaoh, and then when the pharaoh dies, especially if he dies in battle, she still continues to protect him into the afterlife. And you can notice the sun disk on top of her head, just like you would see with Ra, is associated with royalty, even in the Egyptian line. So it's quite possible that she's a daughter of Ra or granddaughter through Bastet. Okay, so this is a section of something known as the Papyrus of Ani, or the Book of Going Out, or what we often call the Book of the Dead, which is, this in particular is referring to those 42 negative confessions that one would have to make. So you would, in your journey through the afterlife, you've died, and you have these magical spells that are to protect you or help protect you in your path to the afterlife, your path to Osiris. So as you're making your way there, you are confronted by 42 gods, or some form of deity. There's 42 because they represent the 42 nomes of ancient Egypt. So Egypt's divided into, they call them nomes. They're small provincial territories. In fact, if you remember when we talked about how Menes, that early Egyptian pharaoh, the first pharaoh of Egypt, how he kind of divided up Egypt to be ruled by governors. Those governors are called nomarchs, and they would rule over these nomes. So there's 42 to represent them, and some of the confessions that you would have to make, right? And these have to be truthful statements. You have to address this deity by its name and make a confession like, I have not committed sin. I have not committed robbery with violence. I have not stolen. I have not slain men and women. I have not stolen grain. I have not stolen the property of the gods. I have not uttered lies. And these would all have to be truthful. I have not been an eavesdropper. I have slandered no man. I have not been angry without just cause. So, like I said, there's a lot of these, of course, 42 of them. And to be able to do that, stare these gods directly in the face, acknowledge who they are, and make that statement and pass on to the next one. And you have to know them all in order. You have to know exactly what to say. They don't prompt you. So getting through that is a huge step. So it's almost like you'd have to study for the test of the afterlife in this case. And that's what that Book of the Dead or Papyrus of Ani was to prepare people for. And like I said, we really only have that one copy of it. Not the one I own. That's a copy of a copy, but there's only really one. But they would have been quite uh, plentiful in ancient Egypt. A lot of people would have been able to get their hands on that. So next, you can see the scene here that depicts the weighing of the heart. So you can see here you've got the heart of the individual in question on one end of the scale, and the feather of Ma'at on the other end. Here's Anubis. He's checking the balance of those scales. And here's Tot, standing back here, recording the kind of decision that comes out of it. And right behind me, you've got Amut, waiting to find out if that person was a terrible person in their life, so he can eat their heart and devour their soul. So basically, there's two ways this can go, or three, I should say. So your heart can be lighter than the feather, which means that you had a light-hearted life, meaning you didn't care about things, you didn't take things seriously, and heart goes to Amut. Your heart can be heavier than the feather, meaning that you've had a heavy-hearted life, right? You've lived a life of lies and evil, and Amut gets to eat. If your heart balances, right? If your heart's able to balance with Ma'at, with the feather of truth, you're going to be permitted to reach the third step, right? Your name will be recorded. You will be then guided on to meet Osiris, who will permit you into the field of reeds. So you can see here an individual who's gotten past the gods and has access to the field of reeds, which basically your harmonious afterlife is living as a farmer on land, growing wheat and hanging out. Which, we look at that today and go, wow, that doesn't sound all that great. You're working even in your afterlife. You're not just lounging on a cloud somewhere, eating the drinking nectar and hanging out with the gods. Well, when you consider where the Egyptians lived and what their life was like, and how unpredictable it could be at times, a place where they could farm and grow crops that were not going to be destroyed and live a happy life with a full belly, that sounded like a pretty good life to me, and probably to them as well. So their afterlife being this field of reeds where they're reunited with loved ones and they're able to just live a life of plenty, that's probably what everyone's dream was. Anyway, so thank you for joining me for our discussion of the Egyptian myths and some of the gods. I hope you'll come back and have some more fun with us. All right, folks, have a good one.